Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Regarding that 5K run, well, I had on my schedule a 6 a.m. run, three times a week for the last 2 weeks. And this morning was one of them, but something else came up, and so I will finish the race. And I will bring up the rear. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for that. I believe that the fundamental purpose of education is to stretch your mind, to learn to think about things in ways you have never thought about before. In fact, I think that if you graduate from college without having had an experience of going, I never really thought about it that way. That's weird, but I want to understand it. If you haven't had that experience, you haven't had an education. And I think the mark of an educated person is to learn how to do that for the rest of your life. Always open yourself up to learning about new perspectives and putting yourself in the shoes of others, be it people of other cultures, other religions, other languages, other academic disciplines. That really is going to be the key to better understanding between peoples and I think a more peaceful and harmonious world. If you go to the foundation building and you're waiting for the elevator, there's a plaque that has a quote from Peter Cooper that says, "Whatsoever shall be true." Now, if you go back to the origins of that quote, he's talking about his own view, which is very much in line with this. He believed that no idea should be unwelcome. No idea should be unworthy of careful examination. You should be willing, even if somebody says something that you really want to take an axe to, and it really cuts at the very foundations of your thinking. You should be willing, as a person committed to lifelong learning and education, you should be willing and interested in finding out more and try to understand why somebody or some group or some scientist or some humanist or somebody representing a religion or other point of view might actually believe what they believe. And follow the truth wherever it leads. So it's in this spirit that I'm delighted to introduce this event. Whether you agree with the speaker or not, I think it's extremely important that as part of promoting vibrant intellectual life on campus, we bring to campus speakers who can challenge us to think from different points of view and think in ways that we may never have thought before and arrive at conclusions based on civic discourse, challenging, vigorous debate, but nevertheless civic debate. I'm delighted in that spirit to welcome to our campus Professor Ian Hutchinson from MIT. He's a professor of nuclear science and engineering, received his bachelor's degree in physics from Cambridge University, followed by a PhD at the Australian National University. As a professor of nuclear science and engineering, his research interests include controlled fusion and plasma physics. He has authored a book entitled The Principles of Plasma Diagnostics, has been an advisor to the government of Canada, and from 2003 to 2009 served as the head of the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering at MIT. Welcome. Alan Wolf probably needs no introduction to this group. I would say probably a good portion of this room has taken his course. And when I mingle with students, Frankie's, Alan, I get this is some of the student, perspectives on your course. Clearly you are easy. Pardon? Too easy? Way too easy, yeah. You got to do something about that grade inflation. Clearly, Professor Wolf challenges our students. which is again in the spirit of what we're trying to do, challenges you to stretch your mind and to think and not to do things mechanically, not be entrenched in ways, and really try to understand fundamental principles and work your way from there. And I think that's an extraordinary teacher to have on our faculty. Alan Wolf received his bachelor's degree, BS, in physics from SUNY Stony Brook, having transferred from Cooper, right? Walked out of Cooper. No, I believe they closed down as part of a round of budget cuts, right? They closed down the physics degree program, and he was a sophomore physics major back in, what was that?
76.
76, yeah. And transferred, and he obviously forgave the institution and came back as a faculty member. His master's and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin in the field of chaos theory and nonlinear dynamics. He has taught physics at Cooper since 1984. Not really cohorts and generations of students. I've met some of his former students who are now successful alumni. And in fact, it was a few weeks ago that I was giving a tour to some of our successful alumni who have been helpful to us in a sort of development capacity. And the tour was actually at night. And one of them said, I want to see the new physics lab. And so we went, I think Bob Hopkins was official host. We went to the physics lab, and I said, oh, that's close. You know? And we're going to disappoint this donor, and we're going to miss out on a $1 million gift. And so I took a chance. I had had Alan on my cell phone since before I came to Cooper, because when I came down last spring just to meet some people, I met with Alan, and I found his cell phone number on my phone, and I called him just on the outside chance that he might be so dedicated to Cooper that he was actually here late at night. And he answered the phone, and I said, Alan, where are you? He said, oh, I'm around. So he just came down, he opened up the physics lab, gave a tour, and the people were very, very impressed.
Did we get $1 million?
He's your former student. You need to.
I'll give him a call.
Okay. And he, in addition to his physics credentials, Professor Wolf has received a JD from the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law here in New York at Yeshiva University, and from 1997 to 2008 has taught courses in patent law and scientific evidence at Cardozo. He has also worked as a law clerk and a scientific advisor to a number of federal judges. Please welcome Professor Hutchinson and Professor Wolf.
Sit. Thank you, President Barucha. I have a number of things to say before I launch into questions. Some of these are my questions, the long-winded ones, and some are questions that were submitted by members of the Cooper community. First, to the student organizers at Cooper, thank you for inviting me today. I'm very pleased to be involved in a discussion of a topic that many people would avoid, especially in a public forum. I don't think that any topic should be off limits for discussion or debate, so long as it remains civil. Second, to all of you here today, while I'm most easily characterized as an atheist, in that I do not believe in any deities, I am not anti-religion. I have close personal relationships with a number of people who are deeply religious. These are people I admire or love, and while I disagree with their religious views, I wouldn't change anything that anybody believes or attempt to do so. I will note that not one of my scientist friends is in fact religious, which I'll get to a little later. Anyway, I hope that no one will take offense at anything that I say today. I'm guessing that I was selected as Cooper's representative for today's event for one of two reasons. Either it was assumed that I'm a hardcore scientist who would take a militant atheistic position, or even a strongly anti-religious position, or more likely the first 5 choices for speaker declined to participate. I'm sorry to disappoint, but I find myself in complete agreement with many things that Dr. Hutchinson has said in his recent book on the subject, which, and I get no commission for this, I encourage you to buy and read. This is a fantastic book. It's entitled Monopolizing Knowledge. Since today's speaker will tell you, I assume, that he is a Christian, I feel I should tell you my own religious or spiritual beliefs. I was born Jewish. I attended Hebrew school. I had a bar mitzvah, and I ultimately rejected Judaism for myself. But I've spent 30 years attracted to and occasionally practicing Zen Buddhism. Zen is a profoundly spiritual practice grounded in the practice of meditation. My own experiences spending many hours in a painful lotus position have convinced me that there are things in the world that are true that cannot be addressed by science. These were experiences that were deeply personal, profoundly moving. I would say that they were life-altering, and I do not believe that there will ever come a time when science can either confirm or deny them. I wouldn't ask science to address my spiritual life any more than I would ask a religion to tell me about the behavior of an atom. To summarize, for me, science is a wonderful part of the world, as is spirituality, but they occupy complementary, non-overlapping spaces in my brain. To Dr. Hutchinson, as I've said, I agree with much of what you've said in your terrific book. I've read most of it. Much of it is devoted towards defining and demolishing what you call scientism, which I'll say the one-sentence extraction from the first pages of the book. I'm sure you'll have more to say. Scientism is a belief that science, modeled on the natural sciences, is the only source of real knowledge. I agree with you. I reject scientism. There are things in the world that are true that science may not address. And I think many other scientists probably feel the same way. There are things in the world that are true in one or another sense that are just not subject to scientific proof. There is one thing that you've discussed in your book and in your talks, and I hope we won't get into this today. I wouldn't seek to censor anybody. People are free to ask about this during Q&A. But it's something that people frequently raise about religion, which is how much evil in the world has been done in the name of religion. You agree in your book that religion has been responsible for some bad acts historically. You note that Christianity acknowledges that the imperfections of both people and organizations. I say sort of, so what? Most of us agree that people and organizations are imperfect. Anyway, I think that's a very interesting topic, but I think it's not relevant to the central issue today. So certainly none of my questions will focus on that. On to my first question, and I apologize because these are some of the longest questions that have ever been written by a human being. There's a famous quote, I forget who wrote the quote. He wrote a long letter to a friend, and he said, very long letter, 20-page letter, he said, I apologize, if I had had more time to compose the letter, it would have been shorter. So had I had more time to really think through these ideas in detail, I would have written shorter questions. So I have here an article from Nature, which is, many of you probably know, is sort of the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. It's an interdisciplinary journal. Sciences of all sorts are represented here. It's dated 1998. The title is Leading Scientists Still Reject God. And this research was started in 1914. Scientists were asked if they believed in God and if they believed in personal immortality. They interviewed two groups of people, randomly selected scientists and what they called top scientists. So the study has been done in 1914, 1933, and 1998. In this iteration, in the 1998 study, so-called top scientists were the members of the National Academy of Sciences. And here are the results of this study, which I find fascinating. This is how many scientists believe in the existence of God. So the numbers were, in 1914, 28% believed in God. In 1933, 15% believed in God. In 1998, 7% believed in God. There was some variation among disciplines. Biologists were among the biggest believers, and physicists were among the smallest percentages. But the numbers were always below 10%. The National Academy of Science, I told you this was a long question. The National Academy of Sciences issued a booklet around this time. Its president said, there are many very outstanding members of this academy who are very religious, people who believe in evolution, many of them biologists, but the authors of this survey say, our survey suggests otherwise. I asked a friend of mine who was a member of the National Academy of Sciences, I called him yesterday and I said, do you know of any world-class physicists who believe in God? And he said, no, I know people who attend church or synagogue as a social matter, but he didn't know a single individual who believes. This is someone who spends most of the year traveling through the world, lecturing to and interacting with top scientists in pretty much every scientific field. So what are we to make of these results? Are these outstanding scientists all victims of or perpetrators of scientism? Or are they doing what good scientists do and asking the hard questions? And would you have them do otherwise than ask these hard questions?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for being with us, Alan. And thank you for inviting me to be here. It's really a pleasure. And I hope we'll be able to open some of these questions. Surveys like this are tricky because a lot of it depends on the questions you ask. There are also surveys that are of somewhat more broader focus on the academy as a whole that have been done by sociologists. And one of the interesting factors is that if you ask about people in universities, in the academy as a whole, then certainly in the US and pretty much worldwide, they do have a tendency to be religious believers to a lesser extent than the society as a whole. And this is a pretty much established fact. But one of the fascinating things about these surveys is if you ask of people in universities, is it the scientists that are least likely to be believers, or is it people in the humanities or the sociological sciences? The fascinating answer is that it's actually the people in the humanities and the sociological disciplines that are more likely to be unbelievers or less likely to be believers than people in the sciences. So when one sees surveys like the ones you've quoted and are tempted to draw some conclusion that somehow it is the science that has persuaded people not to believe or of atheism directly, actually there are plenty of other sociological surveys and data which rather suggest the opposite, because if it was in fact the science that has disproved or discouraged religious belief, then surely of the survey that I just quoted, it would be the other way around. So I don't know that I or anyone has a complete explanation of the data that you've put before us. I think it's probably an observable fact that the level of belief as a whole in Western civilization has decreased through the past century, and you quoted some figures for it. But what one should deduce about science, I'm not quite so sure. I could cite a couple of acquaintances of my own. I mean, perhaps the gold standard of physicist community, at least, is the Nobel Prize. And there certainly are two people that I know personally who are committed Christians who won the Nobel Prize, Charles Townes and Bill Phillips. So, it's not as if there's none, okay, out there, but certainly I accept that the number of outspoken believers in science in the academy is small. If I might give another personal anecdote, my appointment is actually in the engineering school at MIT, although I'm a plasma physicist by training and inclination. Fusion energy is my main interest. I was the head of my department for a number of years, and as a department head, one has to go to councils and so on and so forth. I had to be on the engineering council, and that gathers together approximately 12 of the different, all of the different department heads of the School of Engineering at MIT. And when I joined that council, of the 12 people that were on that council, I knew for a fact that 3 of them were committed Christians because I knew them personally and I had prayed with them. So it simply, you know, the notion that somehow knowledge of science or engineering or technical disciplines sort of rules out religious belief, I don't think that can be sustained, even though I don't have an explanation for your statistics.
The downward trend?
The downward trend, of course, is in part a function of what's been happening in our society. I think that there has been, within the Western world, a trend away from religious belief, although particularly in the US, more so than in Europe, it's been remarkable the extent to which religious belief has remained a very important part of the culture. I don't have an explanation for that either, and if I did, it would be very speculative. But I think what's perhaps even more remarkable is that, contrary to the hopes and aspirations of the militant atheists, religion shows no signs of dying out. And I think that's actually part of what provokes the kind of aggressive atheism that is represented by a number of books by people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. I mean, people, I think they rather wish that religious faith would die out because they think it's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing, and I don't think it's about to die out.
The last part of that was, are scientists doing what they should be doing, which is questioning, or do you want them to sort of apply their questioning nature to be skeptical about their science and then expect them to engage in some other mental process when they look towards spiritualism or religion?
Yeah, I do want scientists to be questioning and to be skeptical. I think that's part of the scientific enterprise. And, you know, I want, in a certain sense, I want Christians to be skeptical and questioning. And that's part of thinking critically about their faith. I don't accept for a moment that these two modes of thought are somehow completely incompatible. And I would say, I would slightly, I would give a different description of my own approach from the one you gave. You said that for you, the spiritual and the scientific are sort of separate parts of the way you think. Yes, I mean, I think there are different approaches to getting to know things that are present in science versus other kinds of disciplines and in religion. But I don't personally think that these things are completely separate. I actually think that there are many ways in which they are overlapping. You know, Stephen Jay Gould wrote a book a little over 10 years ago called Rocks of Ages, in which he advocated a concept which he called NOMA, non-overlapping magisterium. And he proposed, and I'm sure this was meant very constructively, he proposed that science and religion are completely non-overlapping. They address different questions, and that therefore they can never contradict one another. I respectfully disagree. I don't think they are so separate. I think there are plenty of occasions. I mean, I think their approaches to knowledge are different, as are the approaches to knowledge of other disciplines, like history, like jurisprudence, like literature, and so on and so forth. But I would respectfully disagree with Gould because I think there are overlaps between science and religious faith, certainly, and Christianity in particular, which is the faith that I espouse and know something about. So So in that sense, I wouldn't want to give the impression, when I encourage scientists to pursue their, if you like, skeptical viewpoint, the notion that somehow you have to separate those things, and you take off, you put aside your intellect like a cap when you enter the temple or the church. I don't think that's true.
When I was in graduate school, I shared an office with one other person who was a physics postdoctoral associate. We were very good friends, and we sat there sort of side by side doing calculations every day, and she did field theory, and as I was doing chaos. And one day she turned to me and she sort of kept shooting me looks that they were sort of sad. And I eventually asked her what was wrong, and she said, "We're very good friends." She was a born-again Christian. And she said, "We're very good friends, and I feel very sad that you will burn in hell for all time." So I turned to her after a moment's pause, and I said, "Thank you." And then I went back to my work, and a few minutes later I turned back to her and I said, "Do you have any trouble sort of doing field theory one moment and sort of being operating in this other mode?" And she thought about that for a few minutes, and she said, "Sometimes it's difficult to make the switch." So I have a question for you as a scientist, as a good scientist, and as a Christian. Do you ever have trouble making the switch?
Well, I hope I wouldn't make a switch to a comment quite like that. Is it a switch? I think that there are different ways of finding out about the world as it actually is. So that's a lot of what I talk about in my book. I criticize the viewpoint, which I think is very widespread and is in a certain sense the default position in the academy in the West, which is to take the view that the way we find out real knowledge is through the science as modeled on the natural sciences. I think that attitude, which I call scientism, has a tremendously widespread influence in the academy and in society as a whole. It's not often widely explicit in the way people talk, so people don't get up and say, I believe in scientism, I believe that science is all real. They don't usually say that, but it's kind of an unspoken assumption that tends to be present, particularly in the academy. I don't subscribe to that view. I think it's gravely mistaken. I think that science has particular ways of finding out about the world, that these are based on the methods that we inherit from the scientific revolution, which are fundamentally to do with empirical approach to the world about us, which requires repeatability, and it requires a kind of crispness and clarity of expression that is required in order for the natural sciences to function. And I think that there are many very, very important things in life, intellectual things as well as unintellectual things, that aren't susceptible to that kind of analysis. And the example that I give is history. I mean, history is not something that you can do experiments on. It's not something that's repeatable. And yet, I would argue, it gives us real knowledge. So if you ask the question, how do we know that Julius Caesar was stabbed to death by jealous rivals, on the 15th of March in 44 BC? The answer is you know it by history, but you certainly don't know it by science. So the types of evidence and the types of ways that we know things, like history, or the way we get to know things through literature, or in philosophy, or, here's a JD, maybe even jurisprudence, okay? I didn't know I'd be up against a counselor here, okay? So I got to be careful. He's probably good at cross-examination.
Not a trial lawyer.
Oh,
so you can relax.
But I would say that all of these different types of disciplines all have their own ways of understanding the world. They have something to contribute, and our knowledge of the world isn't, this kind of mono-energetic or single-track kind of understanding that you know, it all comes from science. I think that's a grave mistake. So you ask me, how do I make the switch? I mean, in a certain sense, I don't think there's a switch to be made. I think that we are all the time trying to understand the world around us, trying to understand our lives, trying to live out our lives on the basis of all sorts of different types of understandings and knowledge of the world. And it isn't, you have to switch on one and switch off the other in order to understand the world. So I guess I sort of question the premise is what it really comes down to.
And that's a less lengthy question. If your faith is largely grounded in your personal experiences with Christ, or in historical evidence relating to the truth of what's asserted in the Bible, should others find that persuasive? I mean, there are billions of people who accept as true other religions, which I think you would probably consider incompatible with Christianity. They claim similar personal experiences. They claim historical support for their own religious texts. They're as passionate in their beliefs as you are in yours. Are they wrong? Is there a way to reconcile these beliefs? There's a little more. In my own case, after many hours of meditation, I had some deeply moving, very powerful life experiences, but I don't reject the possibility that those experiences were the result of my brain desperately seeking to deal with the pain in my legs and back. And,
that bad, huh?
That bad. That doesn't take away from the insights I might have gained from those experiences, but it does end up being more about the human brain than about an independent truth. But I guess I'd like to focus on the first part of this. What about all of the world's billions who don't believe in Christianity but passionately believe in something else?
Okay. Well, I think that it's widely acknowledged, and I would be the first to acknowledge that a kind of religious impulse is practically universal to humankind. And one response to that is to question how it could possibly be meaningful. But it's equally convincing or plausible or persuasive to respond in the way that religious believers always have, and that is to say that's just what you would expect if God is actually real. Okay, so you would expect, that there would be some kind of religious impulse that's widespread in humanity. So there being a widespread religious impulse that is shared by humankind is not, to me, a suggestion that it's a false impulse. It could equally well, and in my case I believe it is, a true impulse. Yes, I agree with you that I certainly don't take the view that all religions are compatible with one another, and I think that it's kind of obvious if you know anything about religions that parts of those religions are sufficiently incompatible that if one of them is right, the other can't possibly be right. So I think that's true. Speaking for myself, I believe in God primarily because I believe in Jesus, and so I became a Christian predominantly because I became persuaded that, to make a long story short, that Jesus is who he said he was. And I think there are various types of evidence for that. Almost none of that evidence is scientific. Much of it is historical, for example, documentary and so on and so forth. So to me, the Christianity is, in a certain sense, my route to God. And I'm a Christian in a certain sense even before I'm a theist, because I find that the most persuasive thing about my Christianity. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't other reasons for believing in God. I think we could talk about that some more later if you'd like to. But that's, for me, I'm just speaking personally, that's what brings me to believe in God. And I think there are lots of uniquenesses about the Christian message which I find appealing. I don't think that requires me to be dismissive or disrespectful of other people's beliefs. In fact, I hope I am respectful of those, and I certainly try to be so. But I don't think that pluralism, which of course is, I mean, that's part of what's going on behind this question. I don't think pluralism requires you to check your beliefs, at your front door when you go out into the public square. I mean, I just think it's important for our society to enable people of all kinds of different beliefs to take those convictions to the public square. And so I think it's wrong to interpret, the separation clause of the Constitution to somehow banish all religion from public discourse, which tends to be, I think, a little bit of the way we tend to try to interpret it. So I would want to come to any discussion, as I have done in past events and so forth, with an openness to hear what other people have to say, but without feeling that I have to put my own convictions aside to do that.
I'm feeling the need to be a little lawyerly now.
Go ahead.
So, are those who follow Islam or Judaism, are they wrong? Because you believe in the truth of Christianity.
Yes. Well, first of all,
I mean, you can be. I'm sorry. It's clear that you have respect for other religions, but that doesn't mean you have to view them as true.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of Judaism, Christians, of course, recognize that their faith springs out of Judaism. Christians accept, the Hebrew scriptures as part of their scriptures. So Christians have a very, in a certain sense, open, accepting view of Judaism, because they believe that the God we worship is the same God worshipped by the Hebrews and by modern Jews. We believe that Jesus represents the fulfillment of many of the promises of Judaism, and so we recognize ourselves as going perhaps beyond where any certainly Jewish person, Orthodox Jewish person, would want to go. Although there are plenty of Jewish people who do accept Jesus as the Messiah, but of course the majority don't. So, are you wrong if you're Jewish? Well, yes and no, in a certain sense, is my answer. I mean, I think that I would want to say to you, I have found that Jesus is real, and I believe that if you take seriously the New Testament, you might find something that would persuade you of this too. And certainly, when the Apostle Paul went out and preached, yes, he went predominantly to the non-Jewish people, to the Gentiles, but there were at the same time Peter and James, the other apostles, who were going to Jewish people and telling them about what they'd experienced with Jesus and what had happened. And so it's always been an intimate relationship. Of course, there's a lot of baggage, which I'm not denying about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, but from a kind of fundamental point of view, I don't think we disagree. I'm sufficiently ignorant about Islam that I'd be very hesitant to say very much about it.
I was just going to say that would be the tough case, but you don't want to address.
Well,
the tough
look,
case.
here's why it's tough. Jewish people think that Christians are heretics. Okay, I mean, I'm putting it very bluntly. Okay, there is a sense in which Christians think that followers of Muhammad are heretics. And there is a sense in which the succession of religions always, in a certain sense, leaves some people behind and others go forward. I don't find persuasive what I know of the Muslim religion, but it would be improper of me to try to take it on, because I simply just don't know enough about it.
And to the extent that you're suggesting that Christianity can't be sort of critiqued as a matter of scientific analysis based on scientific evidence, which I agree with. It's historical evidence, it's historical data, and maybe personal sort of interaction. Again, these religions claim the same level of historical accuracy of their texts.
Well, actually, as I understand it, the claims are different. Certainly, what Christians say about Jesus is a different claim from what Muslims say about Muhammad, okay? I mean, Christians say about Jesus not just that he was a prophet, but that they say that he was the incarnation of the living God, that Christians recognize a Trinitarian God. They see Jesus as one member of the Trinity, Holy Spirit and the Father being the other two. And it's clear in a certain sense that is unique. Also, I don't think it's the case that any of these religions are founded on historical claims which Christians make to the reality of the resurrection. So in the end, the message of the early Christians was that Jesus, yes, had died on the cross and by that brought salvation, but they also proclaimed that he had risen from the dead. And that's the fundamental claim that Christianity makes, which I think, has a certain uniqueness to it. So, I mean, I would argue that certainly what I find persuasive about Christianity would surround some of those direct evidences, and I find those persuasive.
That exactly brings me to my next question, and I want to warn you, this is a particularly long-winded one. So in the first several chapters of your book, you attack scientism, and as I said, I agree with you on that score. Science is not the only true source of real knowledge. Or to say that another way, not everything that is true is subject to a scientific type analysis based on scientific evidence. Some things require historical evidence, documentary evidence, which is of a very different character than what we call generally science today. But I listened to your talk at Williams College, and one of the things you said was, Jesus made, and this is your quote, such outrageous and self-aggrandizing claims, such as being the Son of God, now I'm paraphrasing, that they must be true because...
But finish your point.
I said I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be accurate here. You said it is generally conceded that he was at the very least, that Christ was at the very least a wise spiritual leader. If his claim about being the Son of God was false, he was not a good man. He was a charlatan, or worse, was completely insane. Then you said his resurrection was witnessed by hundreds of individuals who must have been sincere. They lived out the rest of their lives continuing to assert that they had seen this, so there could not have been deliberate fraud. And that's historical type evidence, and that's the best we can do because we can't conduct experiments. So these things are not subject to scientific proof, but they're still asserted facts. I mean, either he did or did not. There was or was not a resurrection. Either there was or was not something that we could call a miracle. If I put aside my scientific nature for a minute and just be a regular person, which I can do for brief periods of time.
They know about that, right?
I ask myself if these asserted facts are persuasive. I'll agree with you. The claims are outrageous, which is not to say they're wrong, but they're outrageous. I would say, thinking to what people wrote 2,000 years ago, the assertion that there were hundreds of witnesses, given the level of outrageousness of the claim, that for me is not remotely persuasive. There's a very famous quote of Carl Sagan, which goes back actually to a quote of Laplace, which goes back to a quote by Hume. And the Sagan quote was, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." So what is your best extraordinary evidence for the resurrection of Christ?
So let's back up a little bit and explain one point where you perhaps accidentally slightly misrepresented what I'd said, or maybe I said it wrong when I said it at Williams. The discussion there, which I seem to remember went on quite a long time, so we won't belabor that too much here, was to do with this issue that Jesus claimed he was the Son of God, and what was the significance of that claim. The point of that was to say that there have over history been many people who would adopt the position that Jesus was a great moral teacher, an exemplar, and so on and so forth, but that he was just a man. Okay? And the point of that argument is to say that is not a viable option to describe the person of Jesus of Nazareth, because he made these outrageous claims. Jesus' teaching focused on himself very much. So if, in fact, he made those claims, as we see represented very clearly in the historic record, then he actually wasn't a great moral teacher. He was a megalomaniac or a charlatan, okay? And that's the nature of that. So it's to point out that the option of seeing Jesus as a great moral teacher, but just a man, is logically a difficult one to sustain. That's the point of that. So come back to the resurrection. It's, of course, a canard, as you point out, that to say that extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. And the question is, how extraordinary is this resurrection? Of course, enormously extraordinary. Okay, but ask yourself the question: why do we need to have something, have evidence which is so extraordinary for this? If you start from a position which says that there may be a God, that there might be a representative, there might indeed be an incarnation of God on earth, which is what Christians claim, then I think it's no longer the case that this claim is so extraordinary. What makes it extraordinary in the mind of Carl Sagan and others, okay, is very often that they're starting with a presumption that the world as a naturalistic system is closed, and this is contradicting everything that we know about the world. But I don't think that it is contradicting everything that we know about the world. So certainly the resurrection is a miracle and is in a certain sense the founding miracle of Christianity, just as it could be argued, let's say, that the escape of the Israelites from Egypt is the founding miracle of Judaism. But I'm questioning the extent to which one can really argue that there has to be some so totally overwhelming evidence that it isn't reasonable, to take the historic documents, to take the testimony that exists, much of which comes from the New Testament, and examine it seriously.
Are you familiar with the cosmic anthropic principle?
Perhaps you should describe it for their benefit, if not for mine.
I will do that in any event for their benefit. So this is an interesting, I don't know whether to call it a movement or not, in modern physics, in cosmology, in general relativity. It started perhaps 30 years ago, and a number of Nobel Prize winners in physics who study these largest questions like cosmology asked the question if the universe seems to be incredibly sort of fine-tuned, such as to prefer human life. So a number of calculations were done, like what if the mass of a proton was 1 part in a trillion larger or smaller than it is currently? What if the gravitational constant was varied by even the slightest amount? And what they found in every one of these calculations was that it seemed as if the universe was incredibly fine-tuned, such that it permits human life. And they formed a principle, and there were various versions of this principle, which suggests that perhaps there was some organizing principle that preferred human life, and therefore chose all of these cosmological constants so as to facilitate it. And I mention that because it seems to me to be one of those things where science might be sort of consistent with your view of a creator.
So you're asking, do I think the universe is fine-tuned?
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually do think the universe is fine-tuned. There are lots of examples of this fine-tuning. Fred Hoyle was a very well-known astronomer at Cambridge University, and I actually, when I was there as an undergraduate, I wasn't a student of Hoyle's, but I did take tutorials from Jen Nalika, who was a co-worker with Hoyle on cosmology in those days. Actually, Fred Hoyle and Nalika were both, at the time, this was late 60s, early 70s, advocates of steady state cosmology, which was in the process of dying as a scientific theory at that time. It's basically pretty much disproved by the observation of the cosmic microwave background, which had, of course, by then already been discovered. But Fred Hoyle, who was a brilliant theoretical astronomer, is famous for having said that somebody has monkeyed with the laws of physics when he discovered that there was this very specific resonance in the carbon atom, which made it possible for the stars to derive their energy and to proceed beyond the lightest elements and to synthesize the heavier elements, which is what they do. And you know, we here, who are made of many heavier elements, not just hydrogen and helium and so forth, you know, we're all stardust, actually, you know, because those heavier elements come from the stars. He wasn't a Christian, you know, he was a lifelong atheist, but he observed that there were certain remarkable coincidences without which the universe would have been totally different. So I'm just re-illustrating your point, okay? I think that is a very suggestive observation. There are a couple of responses that people have to that, and this is where we come to the anthropic part of things. One answer to that is to say, well, it has to be that way because if those coincidences hadn't occurred, and for example, if the stars had not been able to make heavier elements and therefore make us, then we wouldn't be here to observe it. Okay, that's the fundamental anthropic response. You know, as an explanation of those coincidences or that fine-tuning, I find that very unpersuasive. Very, very. I mean, I don't think it really explains it. You know, and the illustration that is often given is, you know, if you were put before a firing squad, you face this firing squad, and they say, ready, 1, 2, 3, fire, and all the guns go off, and you're still there, and you're still alive, and you say, how could that be? And someone gives you the answer, well, it had to be that way, otherwise you wouldn't be here to experience it, okay? Is that an explanation for why you weren't killed by all those guns? Probably not. You know, it's probably because they were loaded with blanks or they shot the other way, okay? So I think that the anthropic answer to the question of fine-tuning is, to me, slightly suspect. Quite a lot suspect, actually. Maybe you want to follow up.
No, I have too many interesting
Too many others.
I'd like to show a small section of a video from YouTube. Well, wait 1 second. This is from Richard Feynman, who was one of the greatest physicists of the last century and maybe ever. And you know, every time I listen to a piece of Feynman, I say, yeah, that sounds like something I might have said, except he said it better and smarter. So I'm going to ask your indulgence to show somewhere between like 2 and 3 minutes of this. It says a lot about religion and Feynman's view, and I'm just going to ask for your comments on the end.
Should we back up?
Yeah.
If you expected science to give all the answers to the wonderful questions about what we are, where we're going, what the meaning of the universe is, and so on, then I think you could easily become disillusioned and then look for some mystic answer to these problems. How a scientist can take a mystic answer, I don't know, because the whole spirit is to understand. Well, never mind that. I don't understand that. But anyhow, if you think of it, the way I think of what we're doing is we're exploring, we're trying to find out as much as we can about the world. People say to me, are you looking for the ultimate laws of physics? No, I'm not. I'm just looking to find out more about the world. And if it turns out there is a simple ultimate law that explains everything, so be it. That would be very nice to discover. If it turns out it's like an onion with millions of layers and we're just sick and tired of looking at the layers, then that's the way it is. But whatever way it comes out, its nature is there and she's going to come out the way she is. And therefore, when we go to investigate it, we shouldn't pre-decide what it is we're trying to do except to find out more about it. If you said, but your problem is, why do you find out more about it? If you thought that you were trying to find out more about it because you're going to get an answer to some deep philosophical question, you may be wrong. It may be that you can't get an answer to that particular question by finding out more about the character of nature. But I don't look at it. My interest in science is to simply find out about the world. And the more I find out, the better it is. I like to find out. There are very remarkable mysteries about the fact that we're able to do so many more things than apparently animals can do. And other questions like that. But those are mysteries I want to investigate without knowing the answer to them. And so altogether, I can't believe the special stories that have been made up about our relationship to the universe at large, because they seem to be too simple, too connected, too local, too provincial. The earth, he came to the earth. One of the aspects of God came to the earth, mind you. And look at what's out there. How can he, it isn't in proportion. Anyway, it's no use arguing. I can't argue it. I'm just trying to tell you why the scientific views that I have do have some effect on my beliefs. And also another thing has to do with the question of how do you find out if something's true. And if you have all these theories of the different religions, have all different theories about the thing, then you begin to wonder. Once you start doubting, just like you're supposed to doubt, you ask me if the science is true. We say, no, we don't know what's true. We're trying to find out. Everything is possibly wrong. Start out understanding religion by saying everything is possibly wrong. Let us see. As soon as you do that, you start sliding down an edge, which is hard to recover from. And so with the scientific view, well, my father's view, that we should look to see what's true and what may not be true. Once you start doubting, which I think is, to me, is a very fundamental part of my soul, is to doubt and to ask. And when you doubt and ask, it gets a little harder to believe. You see, one thing is I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. I have approximate answers and possible beliefs and different degrees of certainty about different things, but I'm not absolutely sure of anything. And then many things I don't know anything about, such as whether it means anything to ask.
But these are professional doubters, and again, should they turn off their the other aspect to that, which I thought was interesting, was the provincialness, in a world that is full of so many diverse phenomena, infinite star systems. He came to Earth. It's a thing that some of us just find overwhelmingly.
Okay. So I detected three main topics in that clip. Okay, I might have missed some, and you've mentioned two of them. The first one was a discussion of nature. Okay, and I think the argument that Feynman was kind of alluding to with respect to nature is, he's taking the view that we in science just basically want to find out about nature. We want to find out the way things are. Is it like an onion, whatever it is? You have these kind of illustrations. I actually think he kind of misses the point there. And the way he does it is a way that a lot of people do it, okay? Which is that they think that nature, the word nature to describe the world that science examines, is somehow self-defining, that we somehow know what we mean by nature. I actually don't think that it's well defined what we mean by nature from the get-go. And by the way, nor did some of the scientists of the scientific revolution. Robert Boyle, of Boyle's Law, you teach them Boyle's Law, or are they expected to know that?
Chemistry.
That's chemistry, okay, sorry. He wrote a whole book about this question of what is the meaning of nature. He referred to it as the vulgarly received notion of nature. And he pointed out that that word nature means all kinds of different things to different people. And a big part of what he was arguing in that book, because he was a scientist and was one of the founders of the Royal Society, was to argue for a conception of nature as being the normal course of events. Okay? And what he, in effect, was saying was that nature is what we study when we do science. So there's a kind of circularity here, that what we understand by nature today is largely, we understand by nature what is studied by science, okay? But the problem is, you know, we don't quite know what science is. So maybe it would be better to try to understand what science is. What are the methods of science? And certainly in my book, I advocate that it's actually a clearer, more useful, and more fundamental way of approaching this problem, to recognize that science, natural science, as it's been practiced since the scientific revolution, has a rather specific way about about answering problems. And that method of going about developing knowledge, in a certain sense, acts as a kind of definition of what we mean by nature. You know, Feynman couldn't resist personifying nature. He refers to nature as her in this clip. That's quite understandable, because otherwise, you know, how do you somehow avoid this problem? So I would argue that science does try to understand nature, but actually defines what it means by nature by the ways it goes about trying to study it. And those methods are the methods we understand by science. Yes, they involve doubt, okay, skepticism, a requirement of reproducibility. You know, so we don't regard something as a topic to be studied by science unless we can either do repeatable experiments on it, you know, so that if Alan does a physics experiment, you know, here in New York City and gets a certain result, then if I do a comparable experiment, you know, up there in Boston, you know, if I pay attention to the details, I'm going to get the same answer. That's reproducibility. Or else, if it's an observational type of science, for example, astronomy, that he can look out to the heavens, I can look out to the heavens, and we're going to see similar things. We're going to see repeatable phenomena. So I would argue that science is focused on the repeatable phenomena and those things that can be described with a kind of crisp clarity, which is often mathematics. And that that is very appropriate for studying the topics of science, but it, in the end, doesn't apply to other things. Now, the question is, how much can we, coming back to this question of doubt, okay? The question is, can we doubt everything, okay? You know, it wasn't an atheist that implemented the principle of doubt. Descartes, after all, was a Roman Catholic. And he put forward as the philosophical approach that he was going to take was going to try to doubt everything, you know, and then he got everything back to, you know, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. What people don't realize about Descartes is that actually there was a fundamental presumption that he thought was essential prior to that, and it was actually he felt that God had to be a reality which was self-evident and seemed to be self-evident to him. So even Descartes, even someone who, in a certain sense, founded the method of doubt, was not able to doubt everything, and in fact felt that there were certain foundational things. Let me just, you gave me a long question, so I'm giving you a long answer, okay. It's, you know, in a certain sense, this is also a question about the difference between faith and some kind of scientific investigation. And very often, faith is put forward as being somehow the overcoming of reasonable doubts, or even as if it is sort of believing in the impossible. Mark Twain says that the schoolboy's description of faith to his teacher when asked is that faith is believing what you know ain't so. Okay? I want to argue that that isn't what Christians, and certainly not I, think that faith is. We don't think faith is believing the impossible. It's not believing 6 impossible things before breakfast. It's not believing in what ain't so. It's the fact that you have to, in your life, act on incomplete knowledge. You cannot live out your life insisting on a complete knowledge of every situation, your life forces you, moment by moment, to make decisions on almost no basis. And the people in life who succeed, the people in life who make a go of their lives, are people who have a determination, a commitment, have a direction, and they follow it, in spite of the buffets, in spite of their uncertainties, and so forth. So I would like to suggest that religious faith is that kind of principle applied to questions of spirituality. That when we talk about having faith, it is that we don't know everything. Christians or people of religious persuasion, don't have to insist that we know all the answers. I certainly don't know all the answers, but I do think I know some things, and I have a direction, and I have a commitment, and I would say I have a relationship with God, and that's something that I want to act out on in a consistent way. And so, while it's true that this method of doubt is an important part of what we've of a way that we've learned to approach the world, nobody approaches the world with complete doubt, with a complete lack of presuppositions of principles that they follow.
I'm getting the high sign from Daniel that we only have a few more minutes.
You have more time now.
Where did it come from?
Did God intervene and give us more time?
Totally.
Somebody told a joke about airline pilots telling you that they've made up time, and the stand-up comedian said, I thought only God could do that. So these are questions explicitly from members of the Cooper community. Some of the things I've asked so far were questions that were either identical to or I incorporated bits of student questions, but these are explicitly, I disclaim these as my questions. So this one goes, the Bible makes several claims that have been proven scientifically false. For example, the universe being 6,000 years old, the claim that Jesus performed miracles. Does Christianity require a suspension of logic?
Well, no, it doesn't require a suspension of logic. It's not the case, I think, that the Bible claims that the world is only 6,000 years. It's not the case, I think, that miracles have been disproved. So maybe I can tackle them one by one. I mean, it's true that if you approach, let's say, Genesis and the early chapters of the Old Testament in a completely literalistic way, and you try to figure out by looking at various types of genealogies and so forth, how long ago, if you simply add up the ages of all the people that are mentioned, you get to something like 4004 BC in October or something or other, which was Bishop Ussher's famous estimate of when the creation founded. But certainly there's nothing in the Bible that tells you must treat the Bible in that literalistic fashion. And in fact, there's much in the Bible that strongly suggests and indicates that we should not treat the Bible in that literalistic fashion. So, for example, we know that the genealogies, the way that genealogies were written about in Hebrew writing of the appropriate age, it was perfectly okay to leave out quite a few generations. So if we say so-and-so begat so-and-so, it doesn't mean that they were the direct father. They could have been the great-great-great-grandfather, okay? So this kind of literalistic approach to the scriptures has been known, since the 1st century and probably earlier to be not an appropriate way of approaching the Bible. So I don't think it is the case that the scriptures teach that the world is only 6,000 years old. It may well have been, and probably was, the default position of many people in the Middle Ages and so forth, that probably the earth was about 6,000 years old. But that's not, I think, something that is compelled upon one by the way the Bible is written. And why one would assume that miracles are disproved. I mean, miracles simply aren't disproved. I don't believe that it's possible for science to disprove the possibility of a miracle. I mean, I take the view that if science is trying to understand the world insofar as it's repeatable, then that's the principle that science is presupposing. That science is presupposing that the world can be described to some degree by this reproducibility, and that the world follows what we call the laws of nature or the laws of physics. But that of itself doesn't rule out the possibility, that there are occasions when those laws are not followed. Nor does it rule out the possibility that God, as we conceive him, can arrange matters so that extraordinary things happen that are indicative of his power and his activity in the world, which is what a miracle is, that are perfectly, in a certain sense, comprehensible within. So I would argue that the laws of nature, powerful though they are, and extraordinary though they are not something that we know universally apply everywhere. I mean, I know this might well be controversial. There are plenty of people who argue that the laws of nature are inviolable. I simply say that that is not logically required. It isn't required to do good science to believe that under no circumstances can the laws of physics ever be violated. And quite frankly, if you ask about the great scientists of history, which of them believed that the laws of physics are inviolable, you will find that a vast fraction of them did not believe that. So all of the people who were the founders of the scientific revolution, right up into the 19th century, people like James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday, William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, and people like that, they were perfectly orthodox Christian believers who believed that prayers were answered, who believed that God was active in the world, and they simply didn't take the view that the laws of physics were inviolable. Which isn't to say that they weren't effective scientists. It isn't to say that they didn't think that laws of physics were very important. It just simply isn't required to take that viewpoint. So I don't think it is the case that science has disproved miracles.
I think last question before we go to Q&A from the audience. There were a number of questions from people about evolution, the current church stance on evolution, and if there has been sort of a grudging sort of change in how the church views evolution. I don't know if you'll agree that that's true. Does it sort of represent a growing sort of dominance of science over religion on this issue?
Okay. Evolution, particularly in American Christianity, has an extraordinary fraught and contorted history. Evolutionary theory was not by any means universally received by Christians in the United States even as something which was contrary to Christian teaching. And in fact, when it first came out, there were plenty of people in Christian colleges and in Christian churches who thought that's fine, there's no problem. Evolution is consistent with Christianity. If that's the way God created, that perhaps that's the way it happened. Okay. Now that changed through the 20th century in such a way that there became a predominant movement within American Protestantism that tended to reject evolution. I think that that movement was provoked to a large degree because of what I would call evolutionary metaphysics, which used evolution from the atheist side as a kind of stick with which to beat people of religious faith. In other words, people say, evolution proves that your religion is bunk, therefore, you should give it up. And at any rate, the response on the Christian side, in certain quarters of the Christian church, was to begin to reject evolution, and this has become quite widespread, I would say, throughout American Christianity. I personally don't think that there is a problem with the theory of common descent as the mechanism by which biological adaptation and biological diversity has arisen on Earth. I don't think there's a fundamental theological or metaphysical difficulty for Christianity I am personally perfectly comfortable saying that if that's the way God chose to create, and that's the way that the world was designed so that it would bring forth this diversity in a certain sense in accordance with physical law, that doesn't, I don't have a problem with that. And I think that, quite honestly, the evidence, particularly the recent evidence in the form of genomics and so forth, for common descent is increasingly strong and is in many ways overwhelming. I don't think that it's grudging. I think grudging is unfair. It's also misrepresenting the history of the relationship between the church and evolution. I also think, and this is in part drawing on my own background, which is in England and Australia, you know, the problem with evolution and the church is actually much more fraught in America than it is in much of the rest of the world. And you know, there are many reasons one can speculate about why that might be true. But your question was, is science overcoming? I'm not quite sure how I can't remember quite how you described it.
I mean, if there has been a historical trend towards accepting increasingly Darwinian evolution and sort of rejecting some creationist view, does that represent maybe a larger trend towards science replacing religion?
Yeah, okay. I mean, is science replacing religion? No, I said much earlier on that I didn't think that that religion and science are non-overlapping. I think they are overlapping. And I would argue, I mean, I'm not a biologist, so I'm not an expert on evolution, but let me take something I know a bit more about, okay, and you probably know a bit more about, which is the age of the universe, okay? I mean, I think, and this comes back to the 6,000-year thing. I mean, I think it probably was the case that a lot of people thought that the universe was pretty young, okay? For hundreds of years. I think science has shown very convincingly that it isn't young, you know, that it's something like 13.7 years old, 30.7 billion years old, billion years old, and the Earth is maybe 4 and a bit billion years old. And I think the evidence for that is again, pretty much overwhelming and very, very convincing. I mean, that doesn't mean that every Christian in the US believes that. I don't think they do. It's not terribly important to them, actually, I don't think, most of the time. And I think, you know, that there are plenty of people in the US, you know, who just don't pay any attention to that and don't pay any attention to a lot of things. You know, there are people who can't tell you what the capital of France is, you know. But you know, so you know, ignorance is perhaps regrettable wherever it occurs. But I would say that there are ways in which science corrects religion, and from a Christian point of view, if I see something in the Bible, for example, that appears to be contradictory to something that I learned from science, then, you know, one or other of those things probably needs to be thought about, and the interpretation of them, you know, needs to be revisited. So that's the way I approach it.
Daniel, are we ready?
Q&A session. You will now be accepting questions from the audience. Michael?
Yeah. All right, so I grew up in a Christian family. I went to Sunday school for many years. After getting to college, realized that I really never believed what I was told. I am now an atheist. But, so I was pretty much told, you know, the goal of believing in all this is that you'll get into heaven when you die. You'll join the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So will people of other religions, because they don't believe in these things, go to hell? So if yes, isn't that a bit presumptuous? If no, why believe in Christianity? And the other thing that I was told is that through prayer, you can institute this connection between God and, I was told in my particular faith, Armenian Apostolic, to pray mostly to Jesus, who is more connected to the human aspect, and to form this bond. So when I was told to go into my head and talk to Jesus, I only found myself speaking with myself. And I really never saw any effect of the prayers. So the first thing about the goal of getting into heaven, and are the other religions not going to get there, and does prayer have any effect?
Okay, so I think this is kind of a question about what are the reasons for belief. And so let me answer you a little bit obliquely, and maybe we'll come back. You know, I mean, sometimes it's portrayed that people believe in a religion for a particular reason. I think there's a whole spectrum of reasons for religious belief. And I think in the case, you know, if I speak from my own viewpoint, I mean, I think there are arguments. I think there are philosophical arguments. There is evidence, which might be public evidence, and we've talked a little bit about this, about the idea that there might be historical evidence for the truth of religion. I think there is kind of immediate arguments, and this is this question of personal, for example, prayer or personal spiritual experience. I think there are ideas that believing in God makes sense of the world, and this I think of in terms of organization. So C.S. Lewis said it this way. He said that I know the sun has risen, not because I see the sun, but because by it I see everything else. So that's a sense in which a religious faith might make sense of the world, and I call that organization. And finally, that there might be a belief that is based on utility, which might be, you know, believe in God, you go to heaven, or believe in God and you will feel better, or those kinds of things. So you might have noticed that it's A-E-I-O-U, okay? I mean, that's just a mnemonic by which... So I think there's a spectrum of reasons why one might believe in God, and you picked on just a couple, okay? For you, you say you felt that your personal experience of prayer was unconvincing, unsatisfactory, and I think you've said that you don't appreciate, you don't find persuasive an argument of utility, okay, which is, you know, I believe in God so that you go to heaven. But I'd suggest to you there are others, okay, and I offer you some of those other ones, and maybe one should think about those. But come back to me if you wish, because I know I haven't quite answered your question.
What about the people who don't believe in Christianity, like we brought up before? Will they not make it to heaven?
Well, I think Christians say that Jesus is the way to God, and that no one comes to the Father but by him. But Christians also say that you know, what our knowledge of other people's destiny is between them and God. So I would, you know, and for example, we believe that Christians believe that, you know, there are saints of the Old Testament who didn't know anything about Jesus, who presumably went to be with the Father. So I'm not going to speculate about the ultimate destiny of anyone. What I will say is that Christians are also enjoined by their faith and by their Lord to go and tell other people what they have found in the Christian faith and in their relationship with God. And that's one of the things which motivates Christians to go and tell others about Jesus.
Kevin?
You know, people can argue about, you know, who believes in Christ and Buddha, etc. I think it's come to a point where it's, you know, Christianity itself, you can also accept it as culture, right? I mean, there are people within who believe in Christ have different opinions, just as people who doesn't believe in Christianity or other religions. But my question is, if you look at the world as a whole, like, you know, you see all this problem, you know, going on in Islam and around Israel, and, you know, if you look at 19th century Europeans going into Africa and saying, you know, it's our version, my version. So you're carrying this message of God. You believe that you're doing the goods for the people, but at the end, like, you caused all this problem. If you look at thousands of year history, all the wars, it's based on faith, you know, Christians, Middle Ages, whatever. So who accounts for this, you know, terrible mistakes? Is it the people who, I mean, who claim that they carry the message and the will of God, but at the end, it's just chaos, right?
Okay. Okay. So I think this is, you're really asking, what about all the mistakes, the evil that is done in the name of religion? That's part of your question. So the first thing I would, thank you for that. The first thing I would say is, you got to ask, compared to what, okay? And the fact that over history, up until the last couple of hundred years, predominantly religion has been a motivation, not the motivation, but a motivation or a factor in a great deal of what human society have done, including wars and all kinds of evil acts. Is not surprising, because up until the last few hundred years, religion has been a predominant organizing factor within human society. In the last 100 years, we have seen, perhaps uniquely in history, what can happen if religion is in a certain sense banished and explicitly excluded and denied within human society. And we've seen the results of that. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think those results are particularly encouraging to the view that would say, provided we just get rid of religion, everything is going to be sweetness and light. I think it's quite the opposite. So if you ask the question, take the Christian church. I mean, the Christian church is often condemned for, let's say, the Inquisition, which was in many ways a great evil, and tortured people and so on and so forth. But if you ask the question, well, how many people were actually killed, executed by the Inquisition? Scholars can argue about this, but it might be 2,000, it might be 4,000, but that's the ballpark number, okay? If you ask how many people died in communist Soviet Union, were executed in communist Soviet Union as an atheist regime, it's not a few thousand, it's a few million, it's tens of millions, okay? So if it comes to the question, is religion evil? Does religion poison everything, as Christopher Hitchens' famous book title says? I think it's very hard to take that accusation terribly seriously. And I said right at the beginning, I'll concede that I'm not here to defend, everything that's been done in the name of Christianity or of anything else. But I think that right now I would have very serious doubts about someone who is going to say, if we just get rid of religion, the world will be a better place. I think the evidence is actually all against that. You talked about going to Africa and the ways in which the West and Europe has opened up Africa. Ask yourself the following question: is it better that Europe would have gone to Africa in the first instance with missionaries present who took education, who took medicine to the indigenous peoples of those countries? Or would it have been better if, multinational corporations simply went without the religious component? I think it's pretty obvious to most people what the answer would be. So I would argue that this doesn't prove, by the way, that religion is true. It just proves that the argument that religion is inherently evil and poisonous simply isn't very convincing. So I don't know whether I've answered your question, but that's what I would give you around that topic.
Blue shirt next to Mike Katijan.
From a philosophical perspective, it seems that faith generally gains evidence from subjective experience, like revelation. So doesn't that lead to sort of non-realism?
Well, I've mentioned that there's A-E-I-O-U, 5 different ways in which one can categorize the reasons that one might have for belief. And one of those, the I, is immediate personal experience, okay? But the others include evidences. The others include the classic arguments, and fine-tuning is one argument that's often offered. You know, maybe doesn't the fact that the universe appears to be fine-tuned for life, doesn't that suggest that there is creative, intelligent power behind the universe? And there are other classic arguments that are associated with the names of Aquinas and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, clearly, personal evidences, the immediate spiritual experiences, predominantly tend not to be the types of evidences that translate into public evidences. And if that were all that one had in order to persuade one of a particular religion, I think that would be less persuasive. But I just don't think that it is. And let me just say one more thing. I mean, Christians argue and believe that Christianity is a relationship with God. And they believe that, in a certain sense, when we talk about knowledge of God, this isn't just some kind of impersonal, science-like or history-like knowledge, some kind of academic knowledge. The knowledge of God is getting to know in a personal sense. And it's the difference between connaître and savoir in French language. So it's getting to know God, and it's not just knowing about God. And so if that's true, you would certainly expect the personal, immediate spiritual experience to be a significant component in that religious experience. And Christians say it is.
Blue shirt next to Professor Beauvais.
Do you see how religion might draw parallels with totalitarianism, in the sense that there's this whole idea of a deity watching you at all times, and who can punish you for what you think, which is kind of the essence of totalitarianism, and that you have no choice in participating in the event of you're born into sin, for example, from some Christian perspectives, and then that you're born into this, you have to answer for the sins of Adam and Eve, for example. This whole notion in the Judeo-Christian do you see how that could be parallel?
Well, okay, so I think I understand your question. I would actually argue that in many respects, Christianity, and this may well be true of other religions for all I know, Christianity certainly has a track record of being, to some extent, a bulwark against totalitarianism. So if you were to ask, what were the social structures and organizations that were most influential in the fall of communism, a totalitarian regime, in Eastern Europe, then I would say very high up the list, and maybe right at the top of the list, would actually be the Christian churches. So in Poland it was the Roman Catholic Church, and elsewhere it was the Lutheran Church, for example, in East Germany. So there is a sense in which, against human totalitarianism, Christian belief, and perhaps religious belief as a whole, can be a bulwark. Of course, any system which claims to control and dictate the lives of its citizens could become a totalitarian viewpoint. And so, perhaps the Christian church isn't free of criticism on that grounds. That's one answer. But I would say also that there is a sense in which today, in the West, we take the view, by and large, that there is no moral authority higher than the freedom of the individual. That is, in a certain sense, this radical individualism is one of the dominant opinions and reigning paradigms of our moral systems. And I would argue that if your highest moral authority, I mean, I think freedom, personal freedom is very good, okay? I'm not against it, okay? But I do think that if you were to measure Christianity against that as your sole moral yardstick, there is a sense in which Christianity is immoral by that standard. Because Christians say that no, valuable and important and precious as freedom is, there are things that are more important. And Christians would say that making Jesus Lord, which is, in a certain sense, one of the key declarations of the Christian faith, which is to say that Jesus is Lord, is taking my personal self-determination from the dominant determining factor in my moral universe and replacing it with something else. So in a certain sense, I'm answering you, yes, okay? But I'm answering it in the following sense, that Christians say that the service of Jesus is perfect freedom. And it's that paradox that we live by, which is that we put someone else, we say, on the throne of our lives, and that the moral demands and ethical requirements that he places upon us actually end up making us, as individuals, better people than we, not necessarily than you, but that I would otherwise be without that commitment.
That was the last question. Final words between you two?
I'll let you begin.
Well, okay, so thank you so much for this discussion. I mean, I haven't really prepared any kind of closing remarks. I think it's terrific to be here. I've talked about what I think is the Christian viewpoint. I think Christianity sets aside, and I think you also set aside, this scientistic tendency that is so widespread in our society. I think we agree on that. I think, and I've just said, that I think Christianity also seeks to set aside the radical individualism of our society. I think the reason why we as Christians do that is because we believe that the highest moral principles and the governing underlying foundation of the universe is actually neither science nor personal freedom, but it is actually loving relationships. And that's what Christians affirm. That's what we mean when we say God is love. It's part of what we mean by what we say when we say God is love. And so that's perhaps the place where I ought to end.
So last night I was thinking about scientism and whether or not scientists have a religion. And I'm not sure if it's religious or aesthetic or philosophical, but there is a thing that many physicists hold to be true, but not subject to scientific testing, which is we believe that the laws of physics and maybe in other scientific disciplines, when they're true, are very concisely expressed. So Newton's second law, it's just a handful of symbols, and Einstein's field equations are a handful of symbols, and we feel in our hearts that they're true because they're pretty. And and if you ask why, we just say it's a matter of faith, and it's not subject to scientific testing. It's just something that we have in our hearts. So I want to thank everybody for coming today. I know the conversation will continue outside because Rose is booked.
Yeah.
No? Thank you.
Thank you.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.